It is a big old day in Skeptical Journey World today, because today we're doing tangent number 12, which is the sort of culmination of well over a year's work I've put into this one. And it's answering like the really big question that's sort of emerged for me. This is sort of like the natural successor to the misquoting Jesus tangent that I did back in March-ish, earlier this year. And that, just a brief recap, looked at the idea of, can we rely on what the Bible says today actually reflecting what was originally written? The conclusion from that was that yes, that seems to be, other than some little bits here and there which are a little bit up for debate and not so reliable in the finer detail, the big picture is generally agreed by atheist as well as Christian scholars. There's no real dispute that what the Bible says overall is generally what it says today. What that all means still remains very much a question of opinion and faith, but what it actually says and that it is accurate based on what was written originally is not a matter of opinion or faith. That is just one of those historical facts. So with that first question answered now, the next part of the equation, or I suppose actually the third part of the equation, the three legs of the stool of reliability or something like that, the third leg would be what it means, but we need to establish back before that there's another step, being basically, is it true? So the Bible says all this stuff happened, but if it's not true, then there's no point worrying about whether it means anything, because it's just, well, it's meaningless, isn't it? So this brings us to On the Resurrection by Gary Habermas, who clearly had a lot of time on his hand. This thing is a whopper. You do not want to read this in bed. It's not a fun book to rest on your belly while you're laying down. This is only volume 1. Volume 2 is the brown and white thing up there. So what it would mean if the Bible were true is a problem for another day. Today we're trying to solve that problem of, is what the Bible actually says true? Or rather, specifically, I don't think a lot of it matters whether it's true. Whether there was a talking snake in the Garden of Eden or a talking donkey in that story, and whether the plagues of Egypt were real events or supernatural events or whatever, I don't think that actually matters. But what clearly does matter was whether Jesus came back from the dead after being crucified. If that isn't true, then the whole of Christianity falls flat, and Christianity is dead. That is it. That's the end of it. But if it is true, then it's potentially the most important thing ever. So that's what this book is actually seeking to do, to actually tackle that question of the resurrection of Jesus. Did that actually happen? Is it a real historical event? Like if you went back in Doc Brown's time machine when the DeLorean to that point, would you have seen a guy on a cross getting killed and then 3 days later or 2 days later the guy walking around again? In terms of how the event is reported, there are basically 3 versions of what happened. They all agree there was a guy called Jesus who was walking around and got crucified, other than Islam, which says that he was crucified but he was okay again afterwards. It didn't actually kill him. Judaism then says that he was crucified and he died, but he stayed dead because that's what people do when they're killed. So yeah, I mean, Judaism has the sensible answer for all of this. Christianity, meanwhile, says that yes, he was crucified, he died. 2 days later, he made a remarkable recovery, felt a lot better, and was up and back on his feet again. So basically, of the 3, Christianity has the most ludicrous claim of all of them, followed fairly closely by Islam, I think, which, to the idea that there was a switcheroonie, or he crucified and he got better, or didn't die and got better, sounds sort of reasonable, but as soon as you start delving into that, the whole thing falls apart quite quickly. And Judaism is left as the sort of the grown-up in the room full of a bunch of, well, everyone else sounds a little bit like flat earth conspiracists or something relative to the claim of Judaism of, yeah, he was killed, he's dead, that's it. This is what happens when you crucify people. And then for us now is to have a little tangle with what's in this book. Given the size of it, it may not surprise you to hear that I suppose you could almost think of it as a meta-study. So the guy hasn't gone and done anything new, but basically he's gone and taken all the studies ever written, which are all indexed in here, thousands of studies by hundreds of scholars, with a particular emphasis on atheist scholars, actually, which I find really helpful. I suppose it technically should help, perhaps, but I find it removes that sort of bias that if someone who doesn't even believe it agrees that's a fact, then that seems like a better solid fact to me. So the book is basically pulling together all this stuff that's been studied over the last 50 years or so. And apparently biblical study has properly come on leaps and bounds in the last 50 years. And there's a lot of stuff in the last 50 years that basically wasn't there before. So it's a field that has sort of come alive in some ways. Basically, as the end result and objective for the book, though, is to distill all this stuff, like thousands of studies from hundreds of scholars, all the differing takes on how you can do it and all the theories and all this, get it all down to what Gary calls 6 minimal facts, which are basically facts that everyone agrees on. You should add that there are some fringy stuff out there, obviously. Christopher Hitchens, I couldn't believe it, in his God Isn't Great, mentioned several times or questioned that Jesus even existed. But that's just not a thing in any mainstream historical sense, that the question that Jesus existed is not really even the question. Indeed, that's not even one of the minimal facts. It's just taken as a given that everyone understands that Jesus was a real person. The 6 minimal facts take over after that point, and then, well, we shall come on to them in a second and have a look. Very quickly, before we get into the actual minimal facts, the first section is about the philosophy of history. And, well, I thought if you're a historian, you read enough history books, at some point you know enough about history and you become a historian. But perhaps unsurprisingly, it turns out there's a little bit more to it than that. The key idea that comes out of it that really stuck with me is this idea that all of history is probabilistic. So, for example, you and I can't be sure that Adolf Hitler existed because we weren't there. So, all the videos and stories and the rest of it could have been faked. So it's only based on probability that, there's a lot of evidence obviously, that for our minds will satisfy this, that Hitler really did exist. Hitler, of course, is a really easy example because it's relatively modern, videos and all the rest of it. But if you go a bit more remote, you take someone like Alexander the Great. And of course, we're all happy that he existed and he did some stuff, something to do with Greece a couple of thousand years ago. I don't know much about Alexander the Great. But what I didn't realise that with him is a good example here. Our understanding of Alexander the Great and knowledge that he existed is based on accounts that were written about him over 400 years after he died. So, it's kind of like me writing about the ascension of Charles I to the throne of England. Not the current Charles, the one in 1625, right in the middle of the Renaissance and 150 years before the Industrial Revolution even got going. There were basically still dinosaurs running around 400 years ago, and we're basing our understanding of Alexander the Great on what someone 400 years later wrote about him. I'm quite amazed by that. But in probabilistic terms, it is accepted that Alexander the Great was a dude and did some stuff, and that we know what that is based on these accounts so much later. Alexander, though, is not even among the people who are best attested in historical terms. I've tried to get together a list of this because I thought that should be a really useful exercise. It doesn't seem you can really do it because everyone disagrees on how you would categorise people as best attested. But it seems you'd have no dispute at all if you put people up there like Queen Victoria, pretty easy to demonstrate, was very definitely a person, did lots of stuff. Julius Caesar, which is an impressive one, given that's a very long time ago. And Jesus. So, if you try and research this stuff, you're going to keep coming back to people like that, and Jesus is going to be on that list. So in that respect, he's one of the best attested historical figures that we have any information for at all. So as we have with Alexander, there are basically 5 ancient sources that all the understanding of his rests on, the earliest sources that you can find. 400 years after he died, there's 5 of them, and you're like, okay, brilliant, that corroborates that. For Jesus, depending on how you count, but there's around about a dozen, and rather than being written 400 years later, these dozen all fall within 100 years, and the earliest of those date to within 30 years of his death. So, it's in terms of, if you were going to rate the quality of historical information on Jesus versus Alexander the Great, it's not even a competition. It's just miles ahead in terms of what we know about Jesus. I should add there, of course, that the obvious comeback to that is, the Bible's not true, and all the rest of it. You don't even need the Bible to know all this stuff about Jesus. If you delete the Bible, you still have more information about Jesus, more up-to-date information, or more close-to-date information about Jesus than you do about Alexander the Great. So, you could throw the Bible out and you still get a more reliable historical account of Jesus than you do of Alexander. Obviously, just because we've got all this historical information, it's better for Jesus than it is for Alexander the Great, it doesn't mean that what's written is true. So Judaism does have a pretty strong position there, in the sense of it's a much more logical thing for us to accept as human beings, that someone who is crucified and killed stays dead. So it's a hard job for Christianity to push back on that, I think. There is indeed, this opens up a whole area of argument where you get scholars like Bart Ehrman, who we did the Misquoting Jesus, he wrote that. And he's an atheist scholar, clearly very good, knows his stuff. But he will not accept any supernatural miracle type things on the basis that there's no evidence for supernatural things existing at all. So you have a non-starter, in the sense that you can't have a resurrection because resurrections aren't true. Gary, meanwhile, comes back and argues that, well, you can't really do that because you can't disprove that supernatural things don't exist. But the trouble with Gary's argument there is you kind of get to a similar sort of thing with Santa, don't you? So I don't think Gary's argument particularly works there. Of course, the flip side to that is that if it were shown that God does exist, then all supernatural things are back on the table anyway. So I think a lot of this will boil down to how we look at these 6 facts and how we interpret them, or rather what they add up to for us. Because bottom line is, there are plenty of atheist scholars who know these facts. So they see exactly the same facts we're about to look at, and they reach a different conclusion to Christians. So it is interesting in that sense. I should add, there are more than these 6 facts in the book, but Gary calls these his minimal facts because these are the ones that basically everyone agrees. You have to go out to the fringes of nutters to actually disagree with any of these. The rest of them sounds like they're mostly solid in terms of how people accept them, but you will still find mainstream scholars who might argue with some of these other ones. So for this purpose of this video, I'm just sticking with the 6 facts that we can establish are actually facts because everyone agrees on them. But the first one is Jesus was crucified and died as a result. There's a very long-winded medical explanation of how crucifixion works, which is not very nice bedtime reading. Number 2, the disciples had experiences which led them to believe Jesus came back to life. It's not saying that he did come back to life, it's just saying that they had experiences that prove that they believed he did. Number 3 is what the disciples claimed happened was taught very early on after the event, and within the lifetime of people who would have been at the event, and within the area where those people would still have been. So had they been teaching something contrary, people could have raised an objection to it. Number 4 is the disciples were willing to die for their faith, and several did. We'll come back to that. Number 5, Jesus' brother James didn't believe that Jesus was God before his crucifixion, but did afterwards, to the extent that he was one of the founding fathers of the church, one of the very significant people in the church, and died for his faith in his brother. And then number 6, St. Paul, the cathedral guy, he was actively killing Christians for blasphemy until he had a post-ascension meeting with Jesus, which turned him into arguably, well, can't be the most significant figure in Christianity because that would be Jesus, but one of the most significant figures in Christianity. Interestingly, as I understand it, no other religion can come even close to claiming 6 facts that you can come up to a different conclusion for these, I think. It's not, you're going to have a hard time, but it could be done. But they are pretty solid facts, aren't they? They do very much point towards the Christian explanation. You can see where the Christian explanation comes from. There's nothing there that really jars with it. So do you think that is a really big deal to have those? And I would say I haven't even bothered going on to the other less well-agreed facts. These 6 are solid enough in their own right to really put some historical foundation in there. For my part, there's one in there that I slightly struggle with a little bit, and a couple in there that sort of need pulling together because they're a bit more significant than they might seem put like that. The one I struggle with a little bit is St. Paul, the guy, cathedral in London. He was a Jewish leader, and he was very enthusiastic about hurting Christians for their blasphemy in terms of turning away from God and towards Jesus. And he had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, hence road to Damascus moment, there's a saying. But it was quite some time after Jesus had disappeared. So the timeline is that Jesus is killed on Friday. He has a miraculous recovery and turns up again on Sunday. He hangs around with his disciples, eating, drinking, doing stuff, playing games, teaching them stuff, presumably, for around a month or so, a little over a month. And then he ascends into heaven, whatever that means. That's a problem for another day. So, and it's something like 5 years later that Paul has this encounter with him on the road to Damascus. And I'm trying to think, okay, what is the difference between Paul having an encounter with Jesus 5 years after he's gone to heaven than me having one 2,000 years later? Or to put more practical spin on it, perhaps, what's the difference between Paul saying he met God and he told him to do some stuff, and people who like to fly aeroplanes into buildings saying they had a conversation with God and he told them to do stuff which he clearly didn't? There's some frilly detail around that, like in terms of what form did Jesus appear to Paul in, or Saul as he was known then, because God loves changing people's names for some reason. But I don't think that particularly matters. And I think this is sort of redeemed, as it were, by, I think it was 3 years after this, Paul writes that he goes off to see Peter, the head disciple, and then spends a fortnight with him, which would be plenty of time to run through everything God had told him and just check it agreed with everything Jesus had told Peter, lots of names. So I think that sort of fixes that problem. But the idea of Paul as an eyewitness is slightly squirmy for me. I don't quite get on with it. Albeit it becomes reasonable again. We think, well, he went and saw Peter and had a massive chat with him for 2 weeks. So, yeah, so you can basically corroborate your experience, I suppose. So in that respect, I suppose it's probably okay. The big bit for me that needs sort of pulling together, because it's a bit more significant, I think, when you look at it the right way, rather than just seeing the dry facts listed, is what happened with these disciples. So there's a couple of bits in there that are basically the same idea, that the disciples claim they saw the resurrected Jesus and then went and lived a certain way based on that belief. And it's living in such a way that you wouldn't have done if you knew that it wasn't true. I do find that fascinating, that I can't think of anything, well, certainly not religious history, but anything else. Could someone have put themselves in a position to have a miserable life, and ultimately end up being killed for it, as was the case for a lot of them, if that whole thing was based on an event that you knew was not true? If I was Peter, for example, my boss has just been killed, it's pretty awful, there's a mob looking out for me, I've lied to protect my own back and I've run away, I'm in hiding, Jesus doesn't come back, but I go and see all my mates and goes, oh, actually maybe we should just go and tell everyone that actually he came back and that they should live this way, and they're going to be pretty horrible to us about it, but it'd be a nice way to honour his memory, to pretend that he was something he wasn't because he got killed by Romans, and then end up getting crucified for it himself. Just doesn't make much sense, does it? And I have a real hard time with that. Interesting, there's a book on this. Sean McDowell, he did his PhD, I believe, on this very subject, and handily wrote a book about it. I've slightly cheated on that because I haven't read it yet, but I have cheated in the sense that I know what the conclusion is. Basically, that Paul, the cathedral guy, James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, the chief disciple, were martyred for their faith. It seems pretty solid that several of the others were as well, but it's less solid in historical terms. It's a similar idea to this, I suppose. But either way, they were all persecuted for doing it, and then none of them had a nice time and got lots of free stuff and girls and cars and wine, and I don't know what did people have back then. So you just wouldn't do it. The obvious objection to that is that some people do stupid things and out of delusion. And you think, yeah, sure, the odd person might well do that. But this is quite a group of people who, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they were all perfectly sane and normal and sensible and had no reason to actually go and pretend something wasn't true that it was. It just seems highly unlikely that they would all do this and stick to it. It's just, you have a real hard time coming up with an alternative explanation for that. One idea that occurs is there was the Jonestown thing, whenever it was, where was it 900 people died because basically self-inflicted. But as I understand it, that was all a bit of an forget the whole thing, what's the bloody point type of thing, all in one night. And a load of them didn't do it. Most of them, I gather, did, but a load of them didn't. And you think, if we in that context of the disciples, all of them did. And not only do they just keep it up for one night to go, okay, all I've got to do is build up this whip up into a frenzy. And however they did it, I don't know. But the disciples had to keep this up for decades. So it's not like it was a one and done. And you think they might have regretted it in the cold light of day at Jonestown. And the next day with some counselling, all the rest of it. But these disciples, for decades after, 20, 30 years in some cases, that's not a reasonable thing to expect that someone would do that for that period of time. It's just the brainwash would wear off, wouldn't it? So I think you do have to take that idea very seriously, and that evidence for what actually happened is pretty serious, I think. Just to quickly finish up here, because I think this is relevant to the subject we're talking about. There's this idea that the Bible contradicts itself, which it does, definitely. And it says two different things about the same event. A great example is Judas Iscariot, the guy who betrayed Jesus. After Jesus was taken away, Judas goes and it said he hangs himself, but it also says in another part of the Bible that he jumped off a cliff and fell to the bottom, burst open on the ground, and his intestines came out. Nice. So very unlikely those could both be true. But on my other YouTube channel, which is even less popular than this one, on there I just review books I've read, normal books, nothing to do with the Bible. And one of them I read last year was on the Titanic. And it was really interesting that the official inquiry at that time recorded that the Titanic sank intact, despite the fact that a lot of people reported that it snapped in half. And it's really interesting, the inquiry recorded this because it gave greater weight to the officers and celebrities and those sort of people as being sort of just better and higher quality witnesses. And a lot of them reported that it sank whole, even though we know for a fact that it snapped in half, because when it was found 70 odd years later in the 80s, the two halves of the ship are over a quarter of a mile apart. So it's really interesting that there was a bunch of people who genuinely believed they saw something that was not accurate. And it turns out that this is actually what happens in real life things generally. So if you're looking for eyewitness accounts of an event and they all agree, you actually need to be suspicious of that. And in that respect, the fact that the Bible has these contradictions and has different versions of events told by different people, that's actually somewhat counterintuitively evidence for the reliability of them as being actual historical eyewitness accounts. But yeah, so in conclusion, there's a lot of belief out there that faith has to be blind. And I think that's quite clearly wrong. I say if you get blind faith, then that's actually just delusion. I think blind faith is almost an oxymoron as a term. But clearly you can't make yourself have faith. So some of this for me is trying to almost give yourself permission to have faith if you can give some sort of reasonable, rational underpin to what you're looking at. Back in one of the early tangents, the greatest argument, or the best argument against God, whatever it was called, Graham Oppy, being an atheist philosopher, concluded that it's not unreasonable to be a theist. But I think this takes that a step further. It just gives it a sort of a solid historical foundation. And that, yeah, sure, none of this stuff proves that the resurrection is true. But it does at least give it a very solid grounding to suggest that, well, it could be. And you struggle to find a version of events that would fit the facts that we've established here. So if someone turns around and laughs at someone for being a Christian, saying, oh, you're just blind faith and there's no solid foundation to you, it is categorically not true. There is very definitely a reasonable chance that Christians are right. And it's really interesting that the one historical event that Christians depend on for the whole underpin of Christianity not only has, in historical terms, a mountain of evidence, but all that evidence points towards them being correct. If that doesn't give even the most difficult of left-brain skeptics like me permission to have faith, should that emerge, then I don't know what does, quite frankly. And then I think in turn, if you can establish that the resurrection is true, then everything else sort of falls in. You know, you've got talking snakes and donkeys in the Old Testament, and it doesn't make any sense. But Jesus endorsed those. Whether they were literal stories or not probably doesn't even matter, I don't think. But Jesus endorses the meaning of those stories at least. So kind of who cares if they're true or not? There's something to be said for if a guy who came back from the dead says this stuff is worth taking seriously, then it kind of needs to be taken seriously, doesn't it? And of course it would also imply that God does exist, in which case I'm sure he would be perfectly capable of making a snake and a donkey have a chat. So all bets are back on, and it's slightly mad. So it's like this historical underpin for something that a floodgate that can just completely change the entire way that a secular naturalist reader would approach the Bible. Of course, I've no idea where that faith might actually emerge from, but for my part, I'm at least content that this could very well all actually be true. And then I guess somehow from here we've got to figure out what it would mean if someone claiming to be God got killed, came back to life, and gave us a lot of instructions on stuff we're supposed to be doing.